So, I did have a third cynical top 5 planned for this video, but because the first two have been hit hard by Viacom as a corrupt organization, man, I decided to postpone it and just move on to the last part of this seasonal review. At least Gumball isn't owned by Viacom, so I shouldn't have to worry about being harassed by them for this video. But first things first, let's reveal the winner of the next seasonal review. With 31% of the votes, the winner is SpongeBob SquarePants Season 7. Oh, great! 2 nutshots! One, I have to rewatch arguably the worst season of SpongeBob. That's great. And 2, that's a Viacom-owned show, so I assume they're gonna have a blast when I get around to that. Well, luckily both the strikes from my cynical top 5 should expire by then, so that should make it less of an issue. Anyway, the next episode is The Club, which is about the Watersons all going to clubs they're a part of, with the exception of Gumball, who's having a hard time finding a club. And eventually, he gets offered to join the Rejects Club, but he, of course, rejects them, resulting in them attempting to blackmail him, and he and his family fighting them to save Gumball's reputation. Now, first thing I want to praise about this episode is its handling of Gumball's treatment, because when he's looking for clubs and getting rejected, that very easily could have been as pathetically depressing as his treatment in The Robot. But instead, they handle it very nicely, because they make Gumball's ego so big that it makes his rejections much easier to tolerate. Hell, Gumball eventually makes a club centered around only him, which gives us a few hilarious moments.
Okay, don't worry, Gumball. Just close your eyes, let yourself fall back, and someone will catch you. Oh, I'm a bit scared, Gumball. Well, that's why it's called a trust exercise.
Also, the brawl between the Watersons and the Outcasts, it's phenomenal. One of the best scenes from this season by far, as each of the Watersons club experiences come through so they can all play a hand in helping Gumball. Like Nicole's Anger Management Club, Darwin's Synchronized Swimming Club, and best of all, Richard's Fantasy Club.
Freeze spell! You'll have to go without me. I'm stuck for the next 2 turns.
But the Outcasts are pretty enjoyable too. I mean, when nerds become the main villain of an episode, it's usually pretty enjoyable. Usually. But speaking of that episode, they actually realized they got something from that episode right, because it makes an appearance here. Bobbert's Combat Mode. I'm really happy they managed to find a good episode to put this into, because it belongs in a good episode. Yeah, and the best thing about this episode really is just watching Gumball's family take care of him the way they do. It even uses some of their biggest flaws in ingenious ways, like Gumball's arrogance, because that's the whole reason this happens. And the ending just wraps this episode up perfectly. All those in favor of watching this episode a second time, say aye. Aye! The ayes have it. Let's watch it again. So now we move on to The Wand, which is about Gumball and Darwin trying to restore Richard's belief in magic after they find a plastic wand in a cereal box and he tells them about the time he found out magic wasn't real as a youth. While that plot is pretty basic, the episode still manages to get a nice amount of comedy out of it. For one, Richard's reaction to finding out that magic isn't real is a joke that you would think would get old pretty quickly, but it's just long enough to where it doesn't hit that mark.
And I didn't stop screaming for 15 years.
Also, I can't help but wonder how he asked Nicole out when he couldn't stop screaming no. That alone makes it a little more funnier to me. And the ways Gumball and Darwin make Richard's crazy-ass wishes come true are easily the best parts of the episode. Just take this scene, for example.
I wish the sink was fixed.
Well, how do you fix the sink? I don't know.
I mean, that scene not only executes gross-out humor perfectly, it also sets the bar for what Gumball and Darwin are willing to put themselves through just to keep their dad happy. which is so nice to see. That's basically the whole episode though, just Gumball and Darwin finding creative ways to grant Richard's wishes. And eventually, as you'd expect, it gets really hectic. In fact, it leads to Richard getting mad with power, and Gumball and Darwin trying to stop him, while still keeping him from finding out the wand is bogus. And it's every bit as funny and entertaining as it sounds.
Inside out spell! Gross! Back to normal spell!
Give us the wand!
Never!
Also, when you do episodes like this that involve characters going through hell for another's happiness, this is the perfect way to do it, because Richard has no idea Gumball and Darwin are doing this, and everything they do is completely voluntary, so it gets all the humor it can without being weighed down. If I had to pick a flaw though, it would probably be the ending, because it does feel a bit unnecessary after the characters have a really nice moment. But it's not exactly an episode-breaking flaw, and it really just comes down to the way I'd personally prefer the episode had ended. But even then, I still find it worth chuckling at. For being such a simplistic episode, it's one that is loads of fun to watch, kinda like the end with its simplicity. And it's an episode that, in my opinion, really shows off the magic of animation.
Now I wish that your butt was his face and his face was your butt.
Next is The Ape, which is certainly an interesting episode. It's about Miss Simian boasting about her teaching trophies to Rocky the janitor, but when he points out that she never won a Best Teacher award because no one likes her, she tries to bond with the Wattersons and learn what it's like to make friends, with only Nicole not trusting that she genuinely wants friends. Now, first thing I want to point out with this episode is that I don't know if it's self-aware or not, though I do get the feeling that it is being self-aware because it tries to throw in something that's structured as a twist, but it really doesn't feel like a twist if you've been watching all the episodes up to this point and get a good feel for Miss Simian's personality. Also, there's a nice little backstory involving Nicole and Miss Simian that makes you see why she's so hell-bent on not trusting Miss Simian.
I remember you from school. I remember the horrible name you used to call me every day. Do you remember that?
Nice poem, loser! Nice hair, loser! Nice husband, loser!
Hey, what the hell? You established one episode ago that Richard was still screaming on their wedding day. Also, I love watching Gumball and Darwin try to teach Miss Simian how friends behave. That's another nice segment that gives us some great humor.
High five! Okay, now it's... No, I meant slap my... Let's move on to the next lesson.
Now, the part I'm the most split on, however, is the ending, because it's one that really can make or break the episode. I guess I'll just tell you now, cause, again, I don't think this was actually meant to be a twist. But, yeah, Miss Simian wanting friends, that was just a facade so she could get Gumball to write a letter of recommendation so she could win the Best Teacher award and complete her set of awards. And Nicole, realizing this, tries to stop her, leading to a really enjoyable chase scene.
Throw stuff at her!
But isn't that dangerous?
Not as dangerous as disobeying your mother!
Sorry!
Now, the reason this makes or breaks the episode is because the end results are not something most audiences would want to see. But honestly, I don't find it that obnoxious, because everything Miss Simian does still feels perfectly in character. And she really doesn't seem any more unlikable than normal, and her reasons for doing what she's doing are very well established at the start. And in the end, she does still get a pretty justifiable punishment that also gives off a message of why her actions are still wrong in the end. Because by the end of it, what she gets would not be worth it to anyone else, which to me makes it kinda funny. I think this episode is kinda like Patrick Man from SpongeBob. It's filled with stuff I normally don't like, but I think the execution of it was pretty on point and it makes these tropes tolerable. Though, I can tell this is an episode that's gonna split a lot of people's opinions. But I'm personally on the side that enjoys it.
Got it!
Now we have The Car, which is another Mr. Robinson-centered episode about Gumball and Darwin doing work for Mr. Robinson as punishment for launching their bowling ball into his yard. But because Mr. Robinson sarcastically tells them their punishment is a game, Gumball and Darwin instead have a lot of fun doing all this work for him. Up until they accidentally destroy his brand new midlife crisis car. Kinda like The Wand, this episode is a little bit more simplistic and straightforward with its plot, but still manages to get a nice amount of enjoyable and entertaining moments out of it. For one, this is the first episode so far where Mr. Robinson and his wife actually team up to punish Gumball and Darwin, and Mr. Robinson's attempts to make their punishments as hard as possible are constantly thwarted by their lack of understanding of what punishment actually is.
We'll see if they're still smiling after this.
Excuse me. There, we're done.
That's a nice way to get your comedy across. Instead of getting it with the main characters making the Robinsons miserable with malicious torment, they're making them miserable by not suffering from their over-the-top punishments, which is honestly kind of charming.
Goons, come here and paint this fence blue.
Yay!
That'll teach him to mess with Gaylord Robinson.
Done.
Also, while there's an attempt at a twist with who actually destroyed the car, I think you can still kinda see it coming just based off the circumstances of the episode. But even then, it's still executed pretty nicely, and the way the Robinsons retaliates is actually pretty well done, because unlike a certain infamous Mr. Robinson episode, despite them getting punished in the end when they initially seem like the victims, they actually do something to warrant being punished. But again, if I did have to pick a flaw, it would probably be Anais, because she acts like an obnoxious, spoiled brat in this episode and constantly does things that make you want to slap her, like forcing Nicole to take her to see her favorite performer, despite Nicole being exhausted from working a long shift, and constantly talking over her parents in a very annoying way. But she luckily is only in it for a short time, and once she's gone, the episode goes right back to being good again, so I can consider this a tolerable flaw. Overall, this is a great episode. It's mostly focused on comedy, which makes it a little harder to analyze since comedy is subjective. But I would still highly recommend it because I feel like this episode is right up Gumball's alley when it comes to their style of comedy. At least, first season comedy.
Now make it green.
Done.
Orange with purple stripes.
Done.
Yellow with black dots.
Done.
Pink.
Done.
Red.
Done.
Blue.
Done.
Black.
Done.
Yellow.
Done.
And now we move on to The Curse. Now, this is, to me, one of the more memorable episodes from the whole season, but that can always mean one of two things. It's really good, or it's really bad. It's about Gumball having the day from hell in a straight-up Murphy's Law kind of way. Murphy's Law, not Murray's Law. For those who don't know, Murphy's Law is whatever can go wrong, will go wrong. Actually, that does kind of fit with James Murray, doesn't it? That's an idea for a punishment. Guys, if you're watching, which would be very troublesome if you are because you guys should have better things to do, consider something like that. Make everything possible go wrong for Murr. Anyway, unfortunately, I know I'm saying this with a lot of these episodes, but this is also a very simplistic episode because it's mostly just Gumball constantly suffering misfortune. It's very similar to Sorry Wrong Ed actually in that regard, which you would think would mean it's a bad episode, but there is a big difference between this and Sorry Wrong Ed, where Sorry Wrong Ed focused on making Eddie suffering misfortune after misfortune for taking a cursed phone off of Rolf's hands and being mocked by Double D the whole time. This episode gives a different reason to why Gumball became cursed.
It was probably the luckiest thing I've ever seen. So, according to my findings, Gumball used up all his good luck in one day, and that's why today he is left with nothing but bad luck.
I gotta say, this episode executed this idea pretty well. It makes everything Gumball go through seem so much more understandable, and they come to the conclusion that Gumball just needs to survive the day in order for all of his bad luck to end. And you know what? I'm really impressed by the way this episode is written. It's filled with so many things I should hate, but unlike The Ape, where it's executed in a more hit-or-miss kind of way, this episode feels much more well thought out. Like, it wants to go as far as it can with Gumball's torture, but at the same time, it doesn't want it to feel malicious solely for the sake of being malicious. And that's something that's very hard to pull off, but this episode did it. And the humor in this, which mostly focuses on the episode being aware that it's a cartoon and follows very cartoony logic, is again executed very nicely. And to be fair, the cartoony logic was something Sorry Wrong Ed also got right, but I think the Curse's humor is a little more well-rounded and can appeal to much more people given the way it's structured. So yeah, safe to say, this episode is actually memorable for all the right reasons.
In your face, bad luck! I am invincible!
Next up is the microwave. Now, while the curse was similar to Sorry Wrong Ed, this episode is similar to The Day the Ed Stood Still, which is actually a much more flattering comparison if you ask me. It's about Gumball making a gross jar for some reason. I don't know, I guess it's because it's a little boy stereotype. And when Richard accidentally microwaves it, the gross jar ends up becoming alive, and Gumball and Darwin decide to treat it as their child. So, it's kind of like The Day the Ed Stood Still, mixed with Rockabye Bivalve. But the gross goop ends up being a carnivorous monster, and Gumball and Darwin think its behavior is because they're bad parents. I mean, yeah, it's basically a callback to classic monster movies, and it's a decent callback. It's got the classic tropes like how the monster was created, how someone bonds with it and doesn't want to bring themselves to destroy it, how all the side characters get axed off. Well, it's a kid's show, so they're not actually axed off. And it's got some great monster-centered humor, while also working in some funny parent-related jokes.
Darwin! What are you doing? He's your son! I'm sorry, little guy. From now on, I'll always be there for you.
And best of all, this does feel like a genuine monster flick. While it still focuses on being comedic, the tropes it has still give off that feel, and they're not watered down to where it feels like the staff was overly concerned with making it as kid-friendly as possible, which I can't help but respect.
Richard? Richard, stop playing games.
While I would still say The Day the Ed Stood Still is a better doing of this trope, this is still entertaining in its own way and is even worth a few rewatches. A monster of a good time.
Okay, Gumball, now pull! Gotcha! Okay, this isn't working.
And next we have the Meddler. Now, like The Ape, this episode has a few tropes that I normally don't like, though they're not the same tropes as the ones present in The Ape. It's about Gumball getting angry because his parents don't give him enough attention, so Nicole decides to start accompanying Gumball to school so she can give him as much attention as possible. But she ends up meddling into his daily life and babying him in front of everyone. Now the tropes they have in this one that I normally don't like are flanderizing a character and making a character suffer for virtually no reason. Nicole's babying of Gumball feels very forced and it just gets old after a while. Though, I do understand that they're trying to make humor out of the fact that all parents humiliate their kids. But, I don't know, some of this stuff still seems a little too obnoxious to get humor out of. Like this scene, for example, after Gumball accidentally bumps into his principal, causing him to burn himself with his coffee and a few other randomly placed chemicals.
But that's still 2 hours of detention for potentially damaging my beautiful face.
Really, Principal Brown, you need to be firmer than that.
Oh, okay. 4 hours detention.
Now Nicole had to have seen what had happened was a complete accident, yet she's encouraging punishing Gumball in harsher ways. That really doesn't seem to fit her character to me. I mean, I know she's got anger issues, but I don't recall her encouraging unfair treatment to her kids. Hell, she's helped Gumball in the past because of unfair treatment towards him. But credit where it's due, this episode still doesn't come off as malicious or anything. I mean, it gets some really nice comedy with Nicole's meddling, like helping Gumball stand up to Tina. But when the montage of Nicole's meddling comes by, she just seems way too ignorant to what she's doing. Now, does that make this a bad episode? Well, it makes it a flawed episode in my opinion, but I don't know if I would call it bad per se. I mean, once you get past the first half, the second half actually manages to become a decent Gumball and Nicole story, and the ending I find very well put together. I guess I would say this episode is fine. It's not necessarily forgettable like The Kiss or anything, but I wouldn't say it's at the same level of something like The Sock, where, while not being the best, I still find it to be a good episode. It's just a fine episode that I would watch if it was on. And honestly, I do give it a lot of credit for having these tropes I don't like, and not making a totally terrible episode out of them. But it's not exactly an episode I'd be itching to rewatch either. If only it wasn't for that meddling cat.
Even when you're 80, you'll still be my gummy puss.
God, what the hell was up with that nickname, too? Well, next up is The Helmet, which is yet another very interesting episode. It's about Gumball giving his lucky helmet to his family to use, but once he starts experiencing constant bad luck and his parents start experiencing good luck, they all start becoming obsessed with the helmet, resulting in Anais and Darwin setting out to destroy it. Now, the first half of this episode feels very similar to Doug's lucky hat from Doug, but it still got its own Gumball logic to it that it had in The Curse, with luck being something you can actually run out of. Because once Gumball gives up the helmet, he gets hit with a ton of bad luck. And when Richard and Nicole, who want to use the helmet for their favorite game show and for a promotion respectively, become dependent on it, there's a little bit of a hint that you can still make your own luck in this universe. Because despite Nicole acing her interview, once she finds out Richard gave her a faux helmet, she just starts destroying the office she's in, which costs her her promotion. So, I guess that means good luck can be used to keep your anger under control? I don't know, but it's fun seeing how these characters use this helmet, and how the helmet gives them the results they need. But while the first half is fine, the second half, now that's what makes this episode, because it's all a parody of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, mostly the climax from Return of the King. And it doesn't feel the slightest bit forced, despite the first half being nothing like Lord of the Rings. It actually segues really nicely, as well as gets some great humor out of making Gumball Gollum.
Oh, that's mine! Get it back to me! Get it! Dude, what's wrong with your voice? I just really need to cough. Better.
Yeah, the whole second half is everything you want in a phenomenal Lord of the Rings parody. It's humorous, it's adrenaline rushing, it's dramatic, and it has some memorable one-liners.
Oh, look! A tennis ball machine.
Good luck finding a power supply for that.
Oh, look! A generator.
Okay, maybe the hat is magic after all.
Though, not to say the first half didn't have some memorable one-liners too.
Look at you. You're behaving like animals.
Well, I would say the second half does kind of overshadow the first half. The first half still does a great job setting the second half up and giving it the push it needs. The only real complaint I can give, and it's an absolutely minuscule complaint, is it's never explained why this helmet was so lucky. But even then, it seems to be very self-aware and knowingly running off of cartoon logic that it really isn't something you put much thought into anyway. Overall, this is one of my favorite episodes from this season. It's right up there with the painting and the party, but while the painting captures this season's humor the best, and the party captures this season's writing the best, the helmet captures both almost equally as well. If the first season really is the least good of the Gumball seasons, then episodes like this are what I hope season 2 is filled with. Because honestly, this episode is a masterpiece. And finally, we end this seasonal review with the fight. Now, first off, I really wish this episode and the helmet switch places, because the helmet feels much more like a season finale episode, whereas this one feels like a typical, not that special Gumball episode. When Gumball keeps coming home looking like a mess, it's revealed it's because Tina keeps picking on him, which Gumball doesn't seem to notice. And after Anais reveals this to him, she calls up Tina to tell her off, and this results in Tina wanting to fight Gumball. And the rest of the episode is Gumball trying to find a way to avoid fighting her, or to avoid getting too hurt if he fights her. I mean, yeah, it's basically as good as it sounds. Though, there is an attempt at a message in this episode that I'll get to later. First off, what I like about it. Well, I actually do like the comedy in this episode. I mean, the comedy here is mostly visual, but it's decent visual comedy. And there are a few lines that I do find funny. Even some I don't think were meant to be funny, but I still find funny just because of how they were delivered.
So tell me, what's shaking?
Oh, I'm fine.
No, he's not. He's being bullied.
I also like that it explores all the different ways to deal with confrontation and works that into its comedy, like escaping, trying to take the peaceful routes, or just trying to find a way to where you won't get too hurt. But the main message in this episode is that the best way to deal with the bully is to try and talk to them. And that's kind of adult. I mean, I admit talking doesn't always work, but it's something you really should try. And I give it credit for its attempt because I don't think it was that bad. But it is still kind of a flawed attempt. Again, I guess they're trying to say that sometimes people just treat their friends a certain way without any real malicious attempt. But still, some of the things Tina does seem like stuff that would cause genuine issues. So I think if instead of having Tina reveal she didn't mean to cause grief towards Gumball, maybe have her agree to tone things down a notch and see that some of the stuff she did is actually harmful. And it really felt like they were setting this episode up for that, but it never actually comes to fruition because by the end of it, Tina is still doing the same things, and that just left me feeling a bit confused. But, kinda like the Meddler, I would still call this episode fine. While I wouldn't say it fully got its message across, it still managed to be very entertaining, and in a way, I do think they got the majority of what they were going for out there. And while I don't think it's a perfect episode, and I certainly don't think it's season finale quality, I do think it's a decent episode that might even be worth 1 or 2 rewatches. And it's certainly an interesting episode to end this seasonal review on.
I don't think you're a brute.
Really?
Of course. You're just a dangerous friend with a terrifying amount of strength.
Thanks.
And that was season 1 of the Amazing World of Gumball. And how good is it? Well, honestly, a high 7 is not that bad for a first season. I'd say at the absolute worst, it's above average. And honestly, if so many people consider it the least good of the Gumball seasons, I think that just shows what I'm in for if I continue watching this show. And honestly, after going through these episodes and being entertained by quite a few of them, despite a few horrible episodes, which really are to be expected from a show that's still finding its groove, I think this is a show I just might continue watching. Anyway, thank you all for joining me for this seasonal review. Now it's time to move on to other things before I start reliving this. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next... I could have sworn I turned this off before filming. Hello?
Jem, hey, it's the one and only C.R. Martin.
Oh, hey, what's up, C.R. Martin?
No. That's not my name. It's the one and only C.R. Martin.
I really need to call you that?
Yes, you need to say everything, including the one and only part. Especially that part.
Okay, well, what is up, the one and only C.R. Martin?
Well, I assume you know I'm a huge fan of the Amazing World of Gumball, and I figured, since you just finished reviewing the first season and you actually seem to enjoy it, we could...
Wait, hold up there. How did you know I just finished it? I'm still filming the video.
Just a hunch? Anyway, I was wondering if you want to come onto my show and discuss it with me.
Well, don't you live in, Australia?
Yes.
Well, I don't think I could afford the ticket to go out there. Oh, hold on, there's someone at my door. God, this video, I can't believe how long it's taking me to— What the?
So, can I count on you to come onto my show now?
Okay, I guess I'll see you soon.
Excellent. Now go ahead and give your outro. I'll pick you up at the airport first thing in the morning. Ciao for now.
How did you know I was filming my outro? Well, that was weird. Well, anyway, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next review, which apparently will be after I get back from Australia.